We have been fortunate to have had the opportunity to travel and to be able to get access to observe and document many different glassmaking processes. This movie is a compilation of footage shot in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and West Germany during several trips between 1988 and 1993. It takes place before the wall came down and afterwards. None of this video has ever been seen, so I'm very happy to be able to share this archive. This map illustrates 3 areas of Bohemia we will visit. Underlined in red is Lauscha, East Germany, before it was united with West Germany. Jablonec in blue, the beadmaking region of Czechoslovakia. Formerly called Gablonc, it was 95% German before World War II. After the Germans were forced to leave, the Czechs renamed it Jablonec. New Gablonc, West Germany, in green, is where the German beadmakers settled. They brought their glass and beadmaking knowledge with them and started their industry over again. We begin our journey in Lauscha. This picturesque village of blue slate-covered houses has been the center of glassmaking since 1597. Lauscha is famous for blown lampwork, especially Christmas ornaments. In the 1800s, 75% of the inhabitants of the Thuringian area were engaged in cottage industry. Whole families were involved in making a product at home. In the 1890s, Woolworth's 5 and dime stores sold over $25 million worth of these Christmas ornaments in America. A process was developed here to make hollow glass beads using brass molds, blowing small spheres along thin sections of glass tubing, then pearlizing or silvering the insides before cutting the beads apart. Between 1870 and 1940, over 5,000 different molds were made. They found they were able to use plaster for molds, which was very economical. When the area charcoal was depleted, they began using oil lamps to work the thin-walled tubing, using bellows. The gasworks begun in 1867 gave the glassblowers a regulated flame to produce thin-walled products. Blown beads have been made since 1810, yet it's remained a home-based industry. This lampworking industry needs tubing and rod. In West Germany, Friedrich, the same company that makes Kugler, produces 80 colors of rod and tubing for the beadmaking industry. Here at Farbglashütte Lauscha, they produce soft glass-colored tubing. In the 1830s, 150 different colors of glass were produced. In Lauscha, the lampwork production is mainly hollowware. This man takes a metal rod and shoves it down the blowpipe to penetrate the hot mass, creating a void, making it easier to blow the bubble all the way to the bottom of the mass. In 30 years of observing glass blowing around the world, this is the only time we have seen this done. In order to stretch the glass, they will need to be able to hold it from 2 ends. This man is making a large patty of glass on a punty to attach to the glass gathered on the blowpipe. The bubble will stretch with the glass as they pull. For tubing, they continue to blow while pulling, which cools the glass from the inside. Care must be taken not to turn and twist the glass while pulling. They want an even diameter the whole length of the tubing. The tubing is not allowed to set on the floor. This man now is doing the final reheating of this white glass for making rod. The glass pad on this punny has a large notch, which helps him gauge how much he's turning the rod so it doesn't twist. Rod stays hotter than hollow tubing, so it's necessary to fan the hottest areas to control the temperature so it will pull evenly. The wooden sticks on the floor are for the hot rod to set on. They're pulling this white rod the length of the room, 60 meters long. There's not as much demand today in Lauscha for the larger sizes of tubing for making ornaments, so they have stopped production of some sizes now. Most ornaments are made by machine in Asian countries today. He's cutting the tubing to length. This is the storeroom for the tubing and for the rod. One of the uses for tubing and rod is making glass eyes, a specialty in Lauscha. They have a large toy-making industry, so eyes are made for dolls, stuffed bears, and other toys, as well as for people who have lost an eye. This display shows the steps from tubing to the finished eye replacement.
What year did you make this?
1944.
1944.
The age of 16.
16.
No. Was it? Oh.
This stag and dog was his graduation piece from lampworking school. It's a beautiful, striking opal glass, similar to the white used for eye making.
Keine Maschine, alles manuell.
Ja. Geschichte mit den Perlen und interessiert auch hier jemand noch Glasperlen macht. Die verschiedensten Arten auch.
He's putting the pupil on the iris. Each ethnic group needs a particular shade of white to reproduce their eye color. Many times he must blend his own glass colors. He's pulling a thread for making the veins or blood vessels.
Und diese doppelwandige Prothese ist hier in Lauscha erfunden worden.
In Lauscha, a technique was invented to make a hollow, double-walled eye to go over a bad eye rather than a total replacement.
Das Problem ist technisch, das Glas in einer bestimmten Temperatur zu haben.
The problem is to keep even heat in the glass. He's lighting his annealing pot on the stand in the corner.
Jetzt nicht blasen, sondern ziehen.
Now he's sucking as well as blowing to collapse the sphere, creating the shape to cover the eye like a contact lens.
Jetzt können Sie sehen, zwei Wandungen.
He'll use this special grabber to hold it to remove the handle for finishing the eye. A very small, thin torch is used for this delicate work.
So, jetzt Abkühlprozess. So 20 Temperatur.
It needs only 20 minutes to cool.
Sehen Sie, das
So if you're missing an eye, they make this spherical one.
Ja, versteht?
Ja, ja.
Dann perfekt. Patientenfreund.
This is a Czechoslovakian eye maker. The patient sits in front of him in an environment more like a doctor's office as he reproduces their good eye to make a matching one. Jablonec is the home of the Glass and Costume Jewelry Museum, or the Bead Museum as it's known.
This is one of the oldest glass factories in Jablonec. They make colored rods here.
Bead making began here about 1775, but glass has been made in Bohemia since the 11th century. They've been drawing cane since the 1600s. In 1780, there were 54 glass companies. Czechoslovakia's claim to fame is the Mosher glass factory. This factory was situated only a 5-minute walk from the Bead Museum. It was just one of the factories in the glassmaking industry, controlled by the state export company of Jablonec. Formed after Stalin's death in 1958, when the jewelry industry was revived. They were the exclusive exporters of Czech beads. This factory is no longer in production. No one even knows what it was called. Here they're pulling rod on a wooden track the length of this building. They wiggle the glass to keep the rod from getting flattened on one side. This factory doesn't melt any colored glass in its furnaces. They get crushed colored glass from the same source as the famous Czech glass artist Stanislav Lebinsky. These fractured cone shapes are a result of melting it in crucibles and letting it cool. They have removed the crucible by grinding. These are the crucibles, and the crushed glass in the crucible is set into a metal container full of ash to insulate it. Then it's heated in this oven. They take small chunks of this reheated glass and bring them back up to working temperature to pull into rod. In this oven full of chambers, the chunks are constantly rotated to heat them up slowly. They're moved from one chamber to the next, gradually getting hotter, until the final step of putting the hottest one on the hearth of this glory hole to be picked up and heated on the punty. You can see the fork on the hearth for resting the rod while in the glory hole. She will move each of the remaining chunks to its next hottest chamber of the oven. This is quite a process to go through. There must be some reason to go to so much trouble. The reheating and cooling in the crucibles causes the glass to strike or to have variation in color that appears in the final product. This is a very special glass. One of the effects may be what Americans are now calling shampoo glass. It has a lustrous quality I compare to some nail polishes. Picking up the chunk, he pushes it against the rod rest on the hearth. First, he must make sure that the chunk is securely attached to the punty. He hits it with this soft paddle to knock off any loose particles of glass or dirt while it's still hard and relatively cool. Then it's a matter of pressing out air bubbles and shaping and reheating. These water-cooled shields of metal keep the worker cooler. Constant water drips on the metal as it absorbs the heat. He continues to heat and shape the mass until it's smooth and hot enough to pull into rod. This takes quite a bit of time, and I've edited out some of it, but I wanted to give you a sense of how long it actually takes. Notice the short piece of tubing in his mouth. He will blow through this while pulling. She takes the rod and wedges it into the window box so that it only takes 2 people to pull rather than 3. She fans and he blows and fans while pulling. Here another specialty glass is being made ready. Many effects can be put into the rods made for pressing that would be lost in winding beads. Pressing retains the pattern. This is called moonshine. They melt clear glass, so they take a heated chunk of the colored glass and put a layer of clear on one side. This will make a clear cabochon on top of the color when pressed. In a wound bead, any stripes or lines of color would be ruined. He's preparing the end for pulling. This is the rod storeroom. This red hammer and sickle represents the old Czechoslovakia before the wall came down. This was 1988. We would see these everywhere. They've been pressing beads with tongs since the 1600s. This engraving shows the early drucker or pressing tongs being used. You can see the needle at the bottom jaw of this tool. That creates the hole in the bead. They have thousands of these tools around in every workshop and factory. When we asked about buying one of these tongs, one man whose father had been a bead maker told us that they had buried theirs in the sidewalk when they were pouring cement. His father never wanted to see it again. No one wants to use this labor-intensive tool anymore. They've welded some of them together to make decorations in this bar. This factory in Germany still had one of these old tongs in use. It was like seeing something out of a museum. The worker would sit on the right, and the chimney to the left heats the glass rods. A very labor-intensive, slow process. When they shut down at the end of the day, they put the beads in an earthenware pot inside this chimney to cool. That's how they're annealed. Buttons are another item made with these tongs. You can see the needle in the top jaw of this tool.
Yeah.
We borrowed this old tongs from the Glass Museum in Frauenau, Germany, to try it out in the hot glass studio of the Buildwork School. First, we used bead-making rod. It took some experimenting to get the right temperature for the glass and the dyes. The engraved die molds in this tool make a button with a glass shank on the back. It took quite a few tries before we got the glass to make a complete shank. You can see the excess squeezing out around the edge. This die makes a star pattern. We were able to make a few successful buttons, which we ground around the edges. This tool makes a button with holes all the way through. The two needles come up from the bottom and pierce 2 holes through the button. We used hot glass from the furnace for this test. It made a nice pattern. These buttons were made by an automated machine that can make more than one at a time. These tools are used to remove the excess glass from around the edges of pressed beads or buttons. Next, the edges are smoothed by holding the piece up to a sandstone wheel using water for grinding or a wooden one for polishing. They could also be held in a tool like this to be faceted. This is the countryside where you'll find cottage beadmaking. Beadmaking was centered in the Jablonec or Gablonz area beginning 1775. In 1870, Jablonec began to outpace Venice and stayed the center of beadmaking until World War II. In 1880, the School of Applied Arts for costume jewelry production began. In 1836, there were 10,000 cottage glass workers in Bohemia. Now there are only 15 in this region. Behind a large house would be the typical cottage such as this, with a chimney at each end and a vent in the center of the roof to let the heat escape. It can get very hot in the pressing workshop. The factory delivers glass rods. When you see glass rods outside a house, you know it has a cottage workshop. This one's in the basement. For pressing, they use quite large glass rods, which is why you may have noticed some of the imported Czech rods are a larger diameter. He's using a more automated machine. He can make 5 or 6 beads at a time before the glass cools. When the rod gets short, they attach handles to hold them. Engraved die machines were invented in 1838. They allow one man to do 100 beads in the time it took to make 15 with the hand tongs. But it's still a very slow process. Each press of the lever makes 1 bead. They keep several rods heating at a time so they can continue production. He pushes the slug of beads down a chute at the back, where they go into a tall metal can for cooling. The dies are cooled with a water and soap mixture. This black diamond bead simulates jet in Victorian jewelry. The first glass beads were made as cheaper imitation of semi-precious stones such as garnets. The first furnace, built here in 1548, was to replicate garnets. A stripe pattern is achieved using this rod. These pressed beads show some of the effects obtained using striped rod. Again, we see rods outside the cottage. The finished beads as well as the scrap are put outside in gunny sacks to be picked up by the factory for further processing. These are the kind of beads made here, as well as buttons that are sewed onto cards. I was really honored when she gave me this necklace. You can see the dark seam line where the mold comes together in the middle of the red beads. This machine is more automated, like a sewing machine. No more pulling a lever. More beads can be made before the glass gets cold.
They hire this machine from the factory.
Aha.
So when you hire this machine, you have to pay something.
These are some of the dies with engraved patterns. To make buttons, they use the same machine, just a different die. To get a die made is quite expensive.
So we can.
You can see the needle coming in from the right.
Ask them when they set up the machine, does this rod,
Yes.
does it push a hole into the glass, or is the rod inside and the glass go around the rod?
To tady, hele, ta díra, jak se tam dělá, tak to
Tak tady je běhá.
ta projíždí tím.
Ouškem, no.
No, to se chladí a
To se chladí.
to obleje to a udělá to do ouško.
You know, this glass goes around, it makes a kind of ear more. So it's,
that's what I thought.
you know.
This die makes 2 beads at a time.
For this. There were more working.
They're paid by the piece. They make about 700 dozen a day and are paid 15 crown for 100 dozen, so they can make about $5 a day. Hopefully by now wages have gone up. This wooden drum tumbles the beads to separate the excess from the edges. They use sieves to separate out the beads to go to the factory for further polishing. Small beads can be fire polished. The scrap is also collected to be remelted. On the left is a slug of pressed beads. Next they're broken apart, then they're tumbled, and next they're polished. Some are faceted, and they can be sprayed with a fired-on iridescent finish. Next we will visit a similar garage workshop in West Germany. Neuengavlons is the city founded by 18,000 German beadmakers from Bohemia after being expelled by the Czechs after World War II. They brought their knowledge of glass and beadmaking with them and started the industry over. The sieves on the wall are used after tumbling in the drum to separate the finished beads from the excess glass which squeezed out around the pressed bead.
Hollywood.
This cottage industry is barely hanging on in Germany today. The price of labor here is too high to compete with the Asian countries. They use the same handles and large-size rods. Several rods are kept heating so they can continue working as fast as possible. You can see the oil reservoir there above his machine. He must time the movement of pushing the glass rod into the mold with the rhythm of the machine. They can get imperfections if the mold is not the correct temperature. This machine works a little differently than the others. Whoops, he messed that one up. You must continually shove the beads down the slide to the rear. With this machine, he can make quite a few more beads from one heat of the rod before it cools than was possible with the other machines in Czechoslovakia. The beads go down the chute into a can to cool. No further annealing is done. He's also making 2 at a time with this die. This is what the long sections of beads look like before separating. You can see the can here where the beads keep warm only from the residual heat of other beads until they cool. These strips are made with dies for 3 beads at a time. Now we will visit a large bead making factory. There are 40 workers, the only large factory of bead making we've seen.
Mr. Sylvester told that they make these wound beads only for export.
She's telling us the beads are made only for export. None are sold in Czechoslovakia. The exporting is done by Jablonec. This is the workroom with their exhaust system. Each person has their own workstation with space dividers behind them and their own vacuum system. This first person is making pressed glass stones. Note the separate torch tip for heating the dies. She moves the glass rods down the notches of the cast iron form 4 at a time. Very efficient for increasing production. Later, some other decorative processes can be done to these clear stones. These stones would be set into jewelry findings. Some look like opals. On the left are wound beads with applied decoration, and on the right are beads with pressed patterns. These sample books show the range of designs. They assign a sample to the worker, and they're paid by the piece. For every 1,200 pieces, they earn 270 crown, which equals about $10. It takes a good worker 2 days to make 1,200 pieces. Others might take 3 days. So they're paid about $5 a day for 600 beads. This was in 1989. I assume that today they make a better wage. They have quite a repertoire of designs. This factory was started in 1928 to consolidate the cottage workers and to control the production.
What kind of production quantities do they make, like each worker?
This woman was the best bead maker in the factory. She could make 6 beads on 1 wire. You can see they use frit on this brass plate. Notice her arm positions. They customize the room dividers with photos. These beads are curved. This woman is making these red beads on soft brass wire. While the bead is hot, she grabs the end of the wire with tweezers and bends the beads on the wire. Another way to speed up production, they all dip their wires in bead release 2 at a time. Each worker has a double glass shield with an airspace between to protect them. No eye protection is worn. Notice the large nozzle on this torch and how low it is and parallel to the table surface. You can see the cast iron form with the notches for the rods to rest. The flame shoots directly at the rods, warming them. She's using a nice little paddle for shaping. These beads are air-cooled. You can see the rods are preheated. The vacuum cone pulls heat and fumes away from the worker, not up past the face to a system overhead. These cast iron rod rest forms are used everywhere in Bohemia. Each bead has molds for shaping that are specific to that design. Their arms rest on the table. This position gives them a really good support. No strain on the back or the shoulders. Next, we'll see these brown twist beads being made. You can get very good at applying a thread around the edge of a disc when doing 1,200 of them. A broad flame works really well for this large bead. It was really amazing to be in a room of 40 bead makers. If you can imagine the sound of this torch multiplied by 40 more, you would get the idea of the sound level in this factory. This woman uses a leather thumb and finger guard. Even this large bead is air-cooled and then just set on top of the fiber blanket. They don't do any special annealing. Again, you can see her arm position. This bead uses a special mold. As well as the method of applying the glass to create an uneven effect. The mold has wires going over the edge. These are the beads. Here you can really see the residual heat from the torch is preheating the rods. These are some of the molds for wound bead shaping. You can see the notches for the mandrel. The unusual thing about this bead maker is her position at the torch. She seemed really relaxed and comfortable with her knee up in front of her and arms on the table. The woman next to her has been sitting too long. Before the wall came down, beads were made with prison labor. In Valdez prison, 2,800 prisoners made 10,000 beads a day. When the political prisoners were released, it created quite a shortage of beads. These beads really show the skill developed in doing production. In the 1930s, a German couple took bead making equipment to India, and more recently pressing equipment was sent, and a whole new village started to make beads. India is giving them some competition. Helga was my mentor and teacher. I first saw her beadmaking setup in her living room area in her apartment in 1988. I was hooked. I was so surprised to learn that she was a bead maker. Even the Germans involved with glass here are not familiar with bead making. Helga has brought her torch and tools to the summer art school Bildwerk in Frauenau, Germany to demonstrate. Here she's adjusting the flames on her torch. This is the torch used by the German bead makers. It runs on compressed air and it's very quiet. We were experimenting with different types of wire to see what would work. The bead makers use Druckernadeln, but it's not available anywhere else by that name. It's not easy to find. Helga's father and grandmother were involved in bead and jewelry making, and her sister attended the Glass and Jewelry Technical School in Neugablonz, where bead making is a required course. They also teach mold design, and they don't do any annealing. Helga uses the traditional fireplace ash for cooling her beads. Here she's taking a wire to pull a thread from the rod.
Ich bin nervös, wenn mir Leute zuschauen.
No eye protection is worn anywhere. The double glass shield is the only protection. I like the way she holds the putty knife here to make this parallelogram bead. She's got quite a relaxed manner at the torch and forearms on the table. The torch points downward and warms the rods. It has a nice wide flame with this multi-tip torch. Helga was the first one to make hollow wound beads from rod. I brought some of Helga's beads back in 1988 and showed them to others. That is when the technique began to spread like wildfire. European bead makers tend to make beads as components of a piece of jewelry rather than individual masterpieces. These are more recent work. Hollow wound beads. Where does our bead making tradition come from? Where are the roots? This German beadmaker's torch points downward, pre-warming the soft glass rods and allowing the stability of forearms on the table and better back and shoulder support. This is the teacher in Neugablonz. Our torches have evolved from the scientific tradition. In scientific lampworking, the worker often stands up, needing the torch to point upward. He's often pulling large tubing. And he makes large borosilicate apparatus, so has no need for preheating the glass rods. This is a typical American beadmaker's torch bench with elbow rests and the torch pointing up. This is the typical position of the beadmaker at the torch, with elbows on the table and hunched over. Originally, the Japanese kerosene burner was recessed below the table, pointing upward. Evolving from that position, the contemporary beadmaker's torch points upward, arms in the air, no stability, but following from their tradition. Perhaps we would do better to look for the real roots of beadmaking in Bohemia, where there is no history of work-related injuries, such as is showing up here in the U.S. Maybe we could learn something from our beadmaking roots rather than following that of scientific flamework.